Welcome to video 3.2, Unit Testing. In our last video, we learned what Codeception is, how to configure it, and what it can do to help write automated tests for our application. In this video, we are going to focus on the first type of automated test, unit testing. We will learn what unit tests are designed for and when to write them. Then, we'll learn how to load the fixture that we created in the previous video to provide some sample data for our test. Finally, we'll learn to write and run our first unit test. Before we look at our first unit test, it is important to understand what a unit test is and why we might want to write one. Unit tests are named as they are because they are meant to test a single unit of code in isolation. In object-oriented programming, this usually means a single class, and in Yii, it usually means either a model or component class. Typically, when writing unit tests, you only test a model's public API, or more simply put, any function marked as public. This is because you are only interested in testing methods that other classes will be able to access. It is also worth noting that you typically don't test any public methods that either belong to framework-based classes or are generated by Yii, because it is assumed that those methods have already been covered by the framework's own unit tests. Let's go ahead and create our first unit test. We're going to create some new public methods for our monster test model, and we want to make sure they work as we expect. Unit tests go in tests, codeception, unit models, and are named by appending the name of the class you will be testing with test. So in this case, our file name is monstertest.test.php. Open it up and add a namespace declaration. All unit tests extend from the Codeception test case class, so add a use statement for that. We'll also need a second one for our actual model class. We'll add a class declaration and extend it from the test case class. There you go. You've created your first unit test. But it's not very exciting yet, so let's go a little further and make it useful. We want to make sure we have some sample data in our test database, which is why we created that fixture in the last video. Codeception makes loading that data a snap for your test. Simply add an appropriately named public method, fixtures, to your new test class. That method will return an associative array, which points to your unit test to the fixture or fixtures that you need to load to run your tests. Now, Codeception will populate the test database with the data from your fixture before each test. Now, let's actually write a few tests. Codeception actually uses PHP unit to run its unit tests. So in a similar fashion to PHP unit, each test is going to be a public method in your class that starts with test. We're going to create a simple method in our monster test class that returns true if a monster is considered old, and false if they aren't. The method will actually be a magic getter function, which is a neat feature of Yii models. We'll call the method getIsOld. But it will actually be accessible as a property simply called isOld. If you attempt to access an object property that doesn't exist, Yii will look for a method that starts with get and ends with a non-existent attribute. At the risk of offending some of our monsters, we'll make the function return true if a monster is over 40. So head back to the test and create a public method called testisOld. We're going to use PHP unit style assert statements to test our method. Before we do that, we have to tell Codeception to include those assert methods in our unit tester helper. Open up tests codeception unit.suite.yaml, and then add a modules section. Add an enabled key, and then add the value asserts. Switch to the terminal and run codecept build again. You'll actually see that Yii tells us that it included the asserts module in our unit tester class, which provides 19 methods. Based on our sample data, we would expect our application to consider poor Dracula old, but not Miss Medusa. Because these functions return a true or false value, we can use the assert_true method on Dracula, which simply marks a test as passed if the method returns true, and marks it as failed if it returned false. Switch to your terminal and run the test. You'll see that indeed the test passes, confirming Dracula's worst fears. However, if we run assert_true on Medusa, it should fail, as the isOld method would return false. You'll see that Codeception tells us that one test failed, because false is not true. It's even kind enough to tell us which line number to look for the problem. If we use the assert false method, however, then our test will pass, and everyone will be clear where they stand. At this point, you should have a pretty firm grasp on the basics of unit testing. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the next type of test, which are functional tests.